Hello, my name is Sarah Huang. I'm a TA in EPICS. This is the Partner Engagement 3 skill session. Um, so I'm going to go through kind of different methods from anthropology that are useful for designers, particularly when you are thinking about user experience and how better to interact and engage with your client. So first I'm going to go through kind of what is anthropology. So, anthropology literally stands for the study of humans. Traditionally, there are four fields of anthropology: so archaeology, biological anthropology, linguistics, and cultural. And increasingly, there's a field of applied anthropology, which is the use of anthropology kind of within different organizations or within the everyday. So, methods of anthropology, anthropologists kind of utilize various methods. I'm going to be talking about some specific ones that I've listed here. So, ethnography, interviews, surveys, participant observation, mapping and walkabouts, pile sorting, 24-hour recall or focus groups. So, my fourth skill session of this session is is talking about interviews. So I talk about different ways that you can interact with your project partner to ask better questions and kind of get information that you want. Um, and then today I'm kind of going to go through what ethnography and participant observation are. So ethnography is a description of cultures. It's both grounded, reflexive, and also holistic. And so it kind of uses all of these different methods within kind of the one bigger frame of ethnography. And it's basically a way of understanding kind of holistically what is happening in a particular scenario. So in that sense, we call it's multi-method and multimodal. So you use different methods and then there are different ways of really understanding what's going on. So kind of the goal of this is to create a better, more holistic picture of what is happening either with your client or in any sort of different scenario, situation, or in a particular culture that you're studying. So how does this relate to your role as a designer? So you might be thinking, why is this even useful? How can I implement this as an engineer? So to kind of integrate better when you are doing human-centered design is a way of understanding your user better or your clients better. So in order to appreciate kind of the complexity of your clients or your user in terms of how they interact and what they do, but also really trying to understand the motivations behind an individual's practices. So oftentimes we say that what people say is different than what they actually do. And you might have noticed this even with your clients, is that, you know, they might be talking about something, but then you'll notice that they actually do something that's totally different, or they do something that's actually a lot more complex than what they said that they do. So it's not as simple as kind of, you know, reading information online or like reading a book about a particular culture. You kind of miss out on all of these lived details that happen within your everyday. And even if you reflect on your own, you know, life, you might, you know, tell people that you really like one thing, but that's actually kind of a simplified way of explaining something more complex. So as an ethnographer, we use ethnography as a way to form relationships with people that we observe and negotiate different ways of access to participants, getting to know them. And this is often a process that can't be rushed. So as you might realize with your own life, it takes a while to kind of gain trust with people and interact with them. And so, you know, the first day that you meet someone, you'll interact with them a lot differently than, you know, someone that you've known for 5 years. Because, right, there are different cues that you might give. There are different ways that you understand each other. And so this is the same when you're working with your own clients. The first day that you might meet them, they might interact with you differently than, you know, 5 semesters into your relationship. And so it's really your role and your responsibility as a designer to get to know your user and your client so that you can really understand how to design a product for them that best fits the life that they're living, rather than kind of the life that they live on a paper. So we utilize a tool called participant observation. And there's kind of 3 different aspects of participant observation: full participation, participating observer, and then also a full observer. So this kind of stems from the fact that you will never fully experience what someone else experiences, because we all come to a particular situation with our own biases, our own experiences, our own perspectives. And so in that way, we're all unique. But your job as a designer is to try to understand the entire context of your project partner, your client, your user, by participating and observing in their everyday activities. So what does this actually mean? Typically, this would involve joining in with certain activities. So for example, I worked on the Habitat for Humanity team, and a couple of the students joined in on a build day. And this was particularly useful because they were designing a web-based interface for checking out different tools, so that they would be able to, the Habitat for Humanity staff would be able to keep track of, where their chainsaw went and who has that. And if someone else needed it, who could they call to get access to it? And so in order to build this kind of web-based interface, they really needed to understand, how volunteers are interacting with the Habitat for Humanity staff. What does it look like out on a build day? Do people have cell phones? Do people not have cell phones? Do people have access to data? Do they have access to Wi-Fi? So in order to understand that, the students went out and they participated in a build day and were able to better observe, what was happening during that. So this is a good example of, full participation, but also participating and observing what is happening. Another example is living with people for a period of time. This is a good way to kind of understand, the nuances of what's happening in the everyday. For example, if you asked me to kind of recall what I did in the past 5 hours, I might miss some details that you might be able to pick up on if you were actually with me in the past 5 hours. And so a lot of this is kind of, spending time with people and really being able to see what it is that they're doing, or even participating in what they're doing and kind of getting that perspective. Because as designers, we can often miss things because, we might be able-bodied and not have ever experienced, going into a building from a wheelchair or something like that. And so while we may never understand the full experiences of someone who is in a wheelchair, there are different ways that you can, try to participate in that activity as a way of understanding your client better and designing a product for them in a way that matches their needs and also matches their lived experiences. I also want to mention that this is a different activity than just participating in an event. So you might say, oh, but I do build days at Habitat for Humanity all the time. This must be the same thing. It's a little different because with participant observation, you're coming at the situation with particular questions or expectations about learning certain information. So you're not just going and doing things willy-nilly, rather you're guided by a particular reason to understand. So there are different things that you can pay attention to that are helpful in guiding this. Oftentimes we ask to, think about your environment, your context, your surroundings. So like what's going on around you? Are there like 5 parked cars outside? Does that obstruct things in a certain way? Other things you can pay attention to: engagement with people, or people engaging with objects, people engaging with non-humans. What are those interactions looking like? Are they regular? Are they not regular? How does this impact the questions that you're asking? Other things like behaviors. Are there certain social behaviors that occur in one group versus another group? And is that different? So this is kind of what I was talking about. You interact differently with your friends or your roommates than you would with your professor. So are those social behaviors useful in designing a certain product for, a group that doesn't have to, explain things as much as kind of a group that is just newly established. Other things you can pay attention to that's more physical is body language, facial expressions. Are people, signaling to each other in a way that you might not understand what that signal means, but it might be important. And then also conversations. What are people talking about? Do they, when people come together, do they always talk about the weather first? Is that useful information for you? And then also always I recommend using all of your senses. Smells, what do you hear? If you're eating particular foods, is there a spice that is, common in all of the dishes? And then what are you seeing? And if you're like working with, more tangential things, like what does it feel like? Does that matter? If you're working with kids and you're building, a learning device, does it always have to be smooth? Does it always have to have different textures to keep kids' attention? So there are a lot of different things that you can kind of pay attention to when you are going for your, for example, your project partner visit at the beginning. These are all really good recommendations for, what to pay attention to when you're there, because you might think that these details aren't useful, but you never know how they might play into your design. And you might be asking these questions later, like, oh, wait, did the kids interact with an adult at any point during the day? Do they need to, be talking to someone to like build a toy or like use a toy? So there's also some considerations that are useful in implementing this. So gaining trust. It often takes a long time for people to gain trust, and that means that you have access to different things as a designer. So it's really important to build your relationships with your project partners, and spending time with them is a good way to do that. Constant communication. I'm sure that you've heard your advisors and your TA telling you to update your project partner as often as they want. And this is a really good way of building trust, gaining trust, really trying to get to know them as well. All of the feedback that they might email back to you or give back to you in a phone call, all of that information is really telling of what it is that they're looking for. And also just remember that it takes a while to gain trust and build trust with people. People are always skeptical of things. They have their own preconceptions of what their expectations are of EPICS students or of, an engineer or a designer. And so they might act differently. And so just being aware of that and finding different ways that you can interact with your project partner in a way that's, more comfortable for them, more comfortable for you, and also useful for both of you. And then also understanding your own positionality, your own biases. So we all come at this with our own life experiences, our own understanding of situations, and that's okay. It's just important to be mindful that you understand that that's happening, and also just reflecting on it. Like, what are the barriers to understanding a particular situation? If you are reading into a situation one way, like, what are the reasons that you are reading it in that way? So this is something that, EPICS students do on a regular basis through your reflections. So just remembering that that's also a really big part of, why we ask you to do your reflections, is to understand how you're coming at your project and what it is that you're learning from it. And then, there are obviously critics of every method that we use. And so one of them is this method even reliable? So people have suggested that this method is just problematically subjective, in that your focus is too heavily reliant on your own experiences and your own perspective. But my personal opinion is that ethnography uses subjective experiences to enrich a broader picture rather than to dominate it. And so that's why it's really important to understand your own biases, understand your reflexivity, and that participating in an activity or with your project partner, it enables access to different ways of understanding and different insights that would otherwise be unavailable. But obviously this isn't possible without your own kind of reflexivity and understanding of where you're coming at this from. So if we were in person doing the skill session, I would have you kind of go outside and do this activity. Just try to, participate in a particular activity with someone with questions in mind, right? So one example is if you were designing bike lanes on a college campus, how would you utilize participant observation to do that? One way of approaching this is by actually getting a bike and trying to ride around campus. What are some obstacles that you come across? What are some physical barriers that you actually run into? What would make that experience easier? Another way of looking at it is as a pedestrian and having your friend, biking next to you, trying to get from building A to building B. What are some things that you observe as a pedestrian who's interacting with bikes in a different way? And how can you use all of this information to, design better bike lanes on campus with different users in mind? So I ask in the attendance quiz if there are different ways that you could implement this method with your project partner. So what are different ways that, during your first visit with your project partner, how could you implement participant observation in that visit, and how would it be useful for you? So that's everything that I have for this skill session. If you have any questions about this method, please feel free to email me. My email is located on the EPICS website. And thanks for joining.